You're a failure.
And that's okay. Hi, I'm Dan.
And I'm Alicia. And we're failures too.
We take a walk back through people's failures and relive the mistakes they made so we all can have more clarity in how to be a better human. Welcome to the 2020 Perspective, where we show you how to be a successful failure. Today we are speaking with someone we've mentioned on the podcast a few episodes back. That's the magic of talking about failure. Everyone has their own stories to tell, and you may not know how many failures someone waded through to get to their now success. What is blowing my mind is that when I came across this individual, she was someone who was described as a rock star professor, but as we will discover, her self-described failure was failing to teach students how to learn during her first 5 years of being a college professor. And now, she's the Vice President of Learning at edX, a global online teaching and learning platform founded by Harvard and MIT. Welcome to the 2020 Perspective, Nina Huntemann.
Thank you, Dan. It's great to be here.
So where do you want to start? Lead us through your failure.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'll start at the beginning.
Okay. Beginning's a good place to start.
Yeah. So, I was an early career college professor, so excited to have a teaching gig that paid more than a graduate student. And in my field, communication, there's a foundational course that all students have to take. Intro to media, introduction to mass communication, essentially something similar to that. And as a junior faculty member, that was the main course that I was subscribed to teach. So this course, taken by students as an elective, taken by students who are interested in a major, tends to be quite large and broad and very survey. But what's really important is that it is a foundational course for going on in the major. And so any student who's going to go into journalism or advertising or video production or public relations, they had to take this course.
So it's like a communications 101.
Yeah, and I won't quibble about discipline descriptions, but let's just go with that. Yeah, it's a communications 101.
Is it a weed out type course? Because I remember I started in mass communication at LSU, and it was this huge room with 500 people, and they played mind games with you to really just to kind of weed you out if this is really what you wanted to do.
Yeah, a weed out course is somewhat controversial because that's really pushing to have students fail, right? That's an interesting approach to thinking about teaching students. We're purposefully creating a course that you don't in fact continue. But yeah, I think part of the way in which courses like that work is it's introducing students to what would it actually mean to be this when you grow up. And are you sure this is the field that you want to be involved in? And so it can be as much as a weeding out as it could actually be a bit of a honeypot and attract students to a major.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that was...
It's a more positive way of looking at it.
Yeah. And oftentimes it would be a course that was taught to 40, 60, 100, or at some large universities, 500 students at a time. Whoa. I was at institutions where the largest class I ever had in this was about 120. The first time you teach a course, you spend a lot of time preparing for it. I would say for every hour you're in the classroom, you spend at least 3 hours preparing. And so, I say this because in some ways I want to defend my failure. I spent a lot of time creating this class. I wanted to make sure that it was timely, it was relevant, that we were talking about issues in the media that were happening, not 5 years ago, but last month, last week, So I spent a lot of time preparing this course. And I did love the course because it really touches on all these major concepts and ways of thinking for a broad discipline of communication or media. And it also tended to be taken by students who either were in their first or second year of college. I hope what I'm painting here is this was a delight. It was a lot of work, but I loved teaching this course.
Okay.
I got to use all these, examples from the media. And I would often say about teaching survey courses, particularly this foundational one, is, how fun is it that you get to study television for credit? But what we were teaching students was not just how to watch television, but very critically how to think about the media in ways that if you're either going to be making media in your career, you're going to become a journalist, work in advertising, a film producer, or certainly if you're going to be consuming it, which we all do, absolutely important foundational concepts to understand about how media is made so that you can actually be a more critical consumer.
So it sounds like a recipe for success. You have people who want to learn. You are super jazzed to teach it. A lot of people got to take it, and it's relevant, timely, and practical. What could go wrong?
What could go wrong? and for 5 years, as far as I was concerned, nothing was going wrong. In fact, everything was going right. I had a high course evaluations. Students loved the course and me. I had oversubscribed, and so there were wait lists to get into the class. I heard, because of course I never looked, but apparently on Rate My Professor, for these courses in particular, there were a lot of very lovely comments about my passion and how interesting the course is and so forth. So, in the world of feedback, I had so much good feedback that things were going really, really well.
Okay. All right. So things are great. 5 years later, then what?
It was a foundational course, as I said. But as I became a more senior faculty member, I started to take on teaching more upper division courses. So that would mean that for students who were a major and had taken this foundational course, I would be seeing them again in a year or two in a more upper division course. And the way that a good curriculum is created is that foundational teaching and learning is necessary to scaffold what you're going to learn later, right?
Right. You take the 301 after you've taken the 101 and the 201.
Right. And if 301 is designed correctly, 301 requires you to have understood what was taught in 101 and 201. Right. Yeah. So I started to see students again, which is also delightful to have students that you taught, in their freshman year or their sophomore year coming back into your classrooms is really nice. And that was great. I was really looking forward to teaching these upper division courses. I started to realize, honestly, in one of the first upper division courses where I had enough of the same students back again, so I had enough repeat customers, if you will, in my upper division course, who were struggling with the fundamentals. They were struggling to remember or be able to apply some of the fundamental concepts that I had taught in the first course. And this was even true of the good students, right? This was true of the students who had gotten A's and B's in my foundational course, were coming into the upper division course as if they had never taken
Who taught
one.
These students? They didn't teach them anything.
I know.
So how were they demonstrating that they were not understanding the fundamentals?
Yeah, so I'll talk about this one particular moment where I realized that something had been going horribly wrong after 5 years of teaching. So I asked a question of the class about something that has to do with the way in which media is financed, right? You have advertising-based media, and then you have subscription-based media, and then in fact you have publicly funded media like your NPRs and so forth. Subscriptions would be like your Netflix, and then advertising-based would be like broadcast networks like ABC. So fundamental to understanding how media is funded. And I was asking a question of the class, is like, what are the differences between these? And I'm getting crickets. Now, getting crickets when you're in front of a class of students and ask a question, like, that's normal, right? One of the first things I learned early on in my teaching career is that you got to sit with the silence because eventually the students get super uncomfortable with the silence and they'll speak up. But nobody was speaking up. So I started looking into the eyes of my previous students especially the ones who, again, were the quote unquote good students who had done well. And I'm like, with my eyes, I'm saying, you know this. You need to speak up. And the eyes were like staring at the desk, looking anywhere else but me. And so I was bold. And it's always really difficult to call students out who don't want to speak, because it creates, a lot of fear, frankly, in them. And in some ways, it creates a bit of trepidation in the instructor, too, because you're putting them on the spot.
Right.
Yeah. No, but nobody wants that, right? Like, nobody wants that.
Yeah.
Yeah. In the adult setting, too, with facilitating a workshop or something, same thing.
Exactly. So, but I called on a previous good student, and I asked her, I was like, you know the answer to this, like, tell the class. And she looks at me, and like the blood drained from her face, right? And her eyes get super big. And it's exactly the nightmare scenario where I have just like called her out in a horrible way. And I almost like feel what she's feeling. And I realize that she doesn't know the answer. And I pick up on that cue and I quickly pivot, right? And I laugh at, I don't know, I laugh it off or something.
Recovery.
Yeah, I try to, right? And then essentially I just tell the students the answer. But wow, that stuck with me. And I think the heightened emotion that was felt both by myself and by her, like really like underscored that moment. And then of course I had lots of other signals where they were just getting questions wrong on, quizzes and getting understanding and describing concepts and essays incorrectly. And so that one moment really sticks out in my mind, but it was supported by other evidence that students were not recalling the concepts they had learned in the earlier course.
So lead me through kind of like the processing that you had in that moment, the feelings that you're trying to kind of reconcile. You have this contradictory evidence. One may say a red flag. What's your mental machinery that's going on?
Yeah, I am being so vulnerable right now, but I recognize the absolute importance of these moments and sharing them. And I commend, in fact, this podcast for asking folks to do this. But my first reaction was actually to blame the students. And I am embarrassed to admit that. I feel, right, like my first reaction was like, they're not paying attention. They're not doing their homework. They're lazy. That was my first instinct. And as I say, like I wear that almost like shamefully now that was my first instinct. But then the preponderance of evidence, especially because, and I will in many ways like rely upon this student who was so outstanding in the previous, experience teaching her, really did not allow me to put the blame on the students. Like it was just not possible. It was cognitive dissonance, right? To use those usual lazy, I would argue, excuses for bad teaching is to say it's the student's fault. So I couldn't turn away from that. But that was my first, I will admit, that was my first response. But then quickly, to my defense,
you had a second hypothesis.
I had a second hypothesis. To my quick, very quickly after that, I thought, okay, come on now. Why is this the case? Has it just been a really long time? There is a thing, there's a real thing called the forgetting curve. We all experience the forgetting curve. Unless you apply material, use the concept in a frequent or basis, you'll forget it. And so certainly that is at play. But it hadn't been that long. And even with something like the forgetting curve being a factor, that, as I would later learn, is a fundamental friction that teachers have to grapple with. You have to grapple with the fact that indeed students are likely to forget what you teach if you don't teach it well.
Let's take a quick break. Do you want to bring the 2020 perspective insights to your team, community group, or company? This season, we're opening the door to talk with you about your failures. and engage in a dialogue with the community that matters to you.
For this season only, we're running a special offer called the Failure to Findings Talk, where we can help you learn from failure and build a culture around being a successful failure.
Reach out to us at hello@the2020perspective.com and let us know you're interested in the Failure to Findings Talk. Again, that's hello@the2020perspective.com.
Let's fail out loud together. And now back to the failure.
So what you just described there, that forgetting curve and the friction, that's something that I think it's really easy to ignore as a reality when you're in the moment, and especially for like a short period of like a training or a workshop or a seminar or even just a semester long class. You could say, well, if they pass the test at the end of the year, they've learned it, and nobody seems to care what happens afterwards.
What I started to think through was, well, hold on. I don't just want her to remember this material from a course she took her freshman year to one she's now taking her sophomore or junior year. Like, I want her to remember these concepts in her career, like later on in life, as a citizen of the world. And so if I'm not able to do that within a 2-year span, how am I going to have any impact or influence on her throughout the rest of her professional and personal development? And that was, I had to come through to that over time. But when I sat with that, I realized, hold on, that is literally fundamentally what it means to be a teacher.
So as you got to this realization and you're processing it, and you say you sat with it, how were you sitting with it? How long were you these thoughts marinating in your head and asking yourself these questions? What did it look like, and how long did this go on?
So, I'm seeing students again after having taught them the first time. But I also, and I don't even remember what brought me to the Center for Teaching and Learning, but I was engaging with an organization on campus that was literally established to help faculty get better at teaching and learning. But I was engaging with the folks there and their resources and their workshops, and starting to get exposed to, it sounds so funny in the background or in retrospect, getting exposed to an entire field of research about how to effectively teach. I mean, this is the dirty secret, although I wouldn't say it's a secret really anymore, that most college professors whose core job is to teach are never trained in how to do it well. My own training in becoming a teacher was mostly to watch my elders, right? As a graduate student, I sat in classes as a TA and watched a professor teach students, and so I picked up on that. I was given teaching assistant positions in which I just mimicked what I saw around me. I remember taking literally a half-day workshop before I was to be a teaching assistant for the first time in my graduate program in how to teach. And in my memory, all I actually remember, talk about takeaways and forgetting curve, the only thing I remember is that what had to be in my syllabus, and that as a female professor, I probably want students to call me doctor.
Interesting. Those are the two takeaways from the half-day Learn How to Teach for the Rest of Your Profession tutorial.
I'm mind blown right now because I guess I've never thought about this before. I've never thought about, all the professors that I've sat in their classrooms before and I've learned from them or engaged in conversation, whatever, that they have not had this formal understanding of how to teach and facilitate. Like, that's just, I had no idea.
Yeah. The good news on that is that it has become increasingly a known problem. And now graduate programs, far more than when I was a graduate student, graduate programs do integrate how to teach, and obviously discipline specific, because teaching how to teach important, but it's particularly important in a subject, right? And so if you think about K through 12, to become a math teacher, you have to learn particular techniques for teaching math, as opposed to an English teacher. They're fundamentals, but it's discipline specific. So some of the burden of this does fall on any graduate program, but there's a specific burden on the discipline to teach their graduate students, whose jobs are likely to be largely teaching how to do it for their discipline. Most of the focus of graduate programs is teaching graduate students how to do research, right? And the reality of most teaching jobs is that, sure, you have to do research, but particularly for the schools that I was a professor, the majority of my actual day-to-day work was teaching students.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like we could wax poetic about some of the endemic problems in the higher education realm. The fact that they're teaching graduate students how to research, which bring more notoriety to an organization or fame, and you might get a rock star researcher who then generates a ton of income for the school, which draws more students, but who cares about the education because it's really a prestige business. But that's a conversation for another time. I want to go back to the story of you're at the Center for Teaching and Excellence, and you get exposed to this new field, and it just rocks your world, just like it rocked mine and Alicia, rocking our worlds. Then what happened? What happened next?
So I went on a learning journey. And, I asked for recommendations of where to start, books to read, true academic, tell me what to read. But that's a way that, for me personally, that's my first instinct, is to ask for reading recommendations. And so I got some great recommendations of what to read. I also started to go to more of their events, particularly the ones that were around being a better teacher. There was a lecturer who came to campus who was very well known for helping college professors become better teachers. Ken Bain. And I went to his lecture at the institution and bought his book and read it, and just started to rethink. I mean, as I was reading his book, I'm highlighting and tabbing and, dog-earing and then thinking about how to change my own teaching practice as a result. So it wasn't just about learning the theory behind how students learn, very important, but also I need some immediate implementable, activities to start shifting my teaching. And it was a process. I mean, I would introduce something new in my teaching, but not completely revamp the course, because it takes a very long time to create a course. And so it started incrementally, but over time I added in more and more of evidence-based teaching and learning practice. And in many ways I joke, I feel like I got a second degree in teaching and learning by going on that learning journey. And it was propelled not just by my own reading. I mean, I was engaging with faculty at my own institution who I thought were really good teachers. And I was going to events, and I was relying upon the staff at the Center for Teaching to help guide me. I became a student of it.
I'm very curious to know and hear about how you felt. How are you feeling during this learning journey? Because in a sense, you are kind of reinventing the way that you had approached your career. So how was that for you, internally?
So it was exhilarating. I love being in school. And I think one of the reasons why I went on to get 3 degrees is because I loved being a student. And here I had something, I was hyper motivated in this learning journey, right? I had what felt to me a deep responsibility to the students that I currently had and all the ones yet to come to get better at this. And that was fantastic motivation. And I also just love learning. And so for me, it was a joyful process. It was difficult when I would think back on all of the really bad teaching decisions that I had made previously. But I think my just general disposition is, learning moment. What's how do I get better? And I didn't dwell too much, upon it.
Did you get any external feedback on this kind of professional pivot or mindset shift? Like, did the student review scores go up or go down, or were other people commenting on things?
So I successfully got tenure, and I started shifting my teaching to be more evidence-based. And my course evaluations went down.
Ooh, plot twist.
No longer did students describe my courses as fun. Sometimes they would say easy in the past, but there was definitely no easy. Students would describe my courses as hard. You have to do the work. But also things like hard but fair. And you get out of it what you put into it.
Good old
so
Aston there.
While the overall score dipped, right, I felt like they were the best course evaluations that I had ever gotten.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because you're teaching them that lesson that that's going to be lasting, because what you put in is what you get out of it, and all that's real life. That's job that translates into career and their future. And so learning that lesson now is probably more valuable than, a fun, easy course that they enjoyed.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, learning is hard. And it should feel challenging, right? You don't really learn if you don't feel it. And I don't have anything more scientific or brilliant to describe it, but I often talk about it that way when I am talking to educators now, is that if your students are not feeling their learning, then you're not teaching them. And it can be everything. It can be the frustration, their brows are tight, tossing the pencil. It could be the elation of the moment they get it, right? But if it's just all a kind of like breezy, fun time, then they're not learning. And so I think the course evaluations reflected, I hope, that I had made things challenging. And only in moments where you're having to literally work, your brain is having to work and you're being challenged, are you learning?
Did you get any delayed feedback, like maybe years later when they come in for your higher level courses, or maybe even after they graduated? Do you get kind of some feedback that this stuck, or was it not positive feedback years later?
Yeah, so I think the immediate feedback, or immediate, like, within a couple of semesters, is that I had students who had taken the foundational course that I had revamped over time, who were now in my upper division courses, and when I called on them, they had answers. But yeah, so I did get, and this is very anecdotal because I didn't track it, but I stayed in touch. I stay in touch with students in various ways. And I think it's during this time too where LinkedIn became really, used and popular. And so a lot of my students were connecting with me on LinkedIn. And so in many ways I could see their professional development. And there's this one student who will remain anonymous, but I couldn't be prouder of her because her career, she's a journalist, she specifically writes about media industries and their revenue models and how they're breaking and having to retool and so forth. She's written fantastic pieces recently about Disney Plus and Netflix strategy. And, my head is huge because I know at least at the beginning of her career, she learned those fundamental things from me.
Wow.
So, yeah.
That is delayed feedback. Wow, that's good.
Yeah, that's a nice validation for you, a little pat on the back that you had a part in that. That's awesome.
This is a wonderful, wonderful story. I mean, do you have any other kind of pearls of wisdom or things you got out of this kind of failure realization, this failure experience that you think would be really interesting to share?
Yeah, I was thinking about some of the takeaway lessons, particularly as I've used them in my position now as VP of Learning at edX. I do a lot of faculty engagement and faculty development workshops and so forth with universities and faculty from around the world. So it's great. I get to talk to people in all different kinds of circumstances and disciplines. This concept of assessing, an assessment, and I mean this in two ways. How I was assessing my students' learning. So some of the mistakes that I had been making in my teaching practice is that I wasn't assessing student learning well. I was using, in some cases, multiple choice exams, which have their place. They definitely have their place, but even the way in which I had designed the questions and so forth just wasn't authentic learning. It didn't really assess students' learning. So I learned that how I was assessing students' learning was flawed. And interestingly, how my performance as a teacher was being assessed was also flawed.
Ooh,
so
spicy.
Yeah, it's this two-sided, story in a way, is that course evaluations of teaching are very poor mechanisms to assess student learning. And so the way that carries forward, no matter what profession you're in or even in your personal life, is that, when you go to either self-assess or ask peers for feedback, it is so important that how you're being evaluated reflects what you actually want to measure, right? And I think that could be felt in everyday ways where if you ask a colleague for feedback, you don't just say to them, like, give me some feedback.
Right.
Because they'll be like, oh, you're great. I love you. You're fabulous. It's like, okay. No, you want to be really specific, right? You want to think about that question.
That is juicy. And there's so many parallels that I'm drawing with, for me personally, like with my job and even my last job. One of the struggles that we had was assessing adult learning around, all these different concepts around leadership and the old smile sheet, as they call it, which was, did you enjoy this course? Would you recommend it? That's great. And yes, it can be a fun, easy breezy time that we network and have some nice takeaways, but how are we really going to see the objectives from that course, workshop, whatever, reflected in performance change? I mean, it's the same thing. And I think it's so much harder than people realize. They want to walk in and they want to almost be entertained. And that's really not the case. It's nice to be entertaining, but if it doesn't translate into knowledge transfer, then we haven't done our job.
Or they assume that you just pour knowledge into their heads and it's just kind of like a painless, download. And learning is hard, like you said. It's hard. It's sometimes painful. It's awkward, uncomfortable. And I mean, we don't have to get too topical, but there's a lot of pain going on because people weren't willing to educate themselves appropriately.
To tie back to the episode in which you mentioned me, one of the things that is really interesting about game design, and there's so many parallels between game design and learning design, but one of them is that games can be fun. In fact, that's one of the main reasons why I play them. But I don't find games that are easy to be enjoyable. I actually want that challenge and that friction, and I want to be pushed right outside of my comfort zone, so I have to work at it. And it feels so much more satisfying. Well, it's a very similar principle in learning, right? I had been teaching students the fun, easy, comfortable way, and as a result, they didn't learn. They enjoyed my classes, but, again, outcomes weren't met. So I think that, hard does not mean not enjoyable. Hard does not mean you have to hate it. I certainly didn't want to and don't create learning experiences like that. But there is something about pushing your limits, right? In a structured and certainly safe way that is incredibly, incredibly rewarding.
What did you think about Nina's episode?
So first thing is starstruck, because she and I collided back at an old job, and the fact that we reconnected because of this podcast is so heartwarming. That I was already impressed to hear her story and how much she's thought about it. Of course, we talked to people who have been a little reflective and learned from it, but her craft and her way of approaching her craft is super enlightening and super motivating. The way that she broke down her realization, her previous thought patterns, her new thought patterns, how she got to those new thought patterns, how they were informed by the context that they were in. That's super deep thinking. Super deep.
I totally agree. She's clearly a professor for a reason. She can get all up in there. And I like what you said about her almost redesigning her thought patterns because of this experience. If we could just take how she did that inside of her brain and extract it and then just toss it out to other people, then everyone would just be on their game all the time. If they could model their failures, the process of overcoming their failures the same way that she did, then everyone would be wanting failure, instead of avoiding it.
And I think her role and her position gave her special context that I think the rest of us mere mortals just wish we could have. Teaching in a university, it's a cyclical, repeating process. So you're collecting data points in the same manner. You can evaluate them year over year. This isn't just a 2-month project. This is a multi-year self-discovery process. And having the data simply from the repeat conversations that she's having with her students was, I think, instrumental in her being able to realize and reflect and say, oh snap, they didn't learn anything. I have the data now. Now I can do something about it.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is the right term, but I think it is the right term to use here, is her emotional agility. For the reason that you just said, is this is a multi-year process. So she was just, chugging along, doing her thing, teaching, getting great accolades and feedback, and then all of a sudden she hits this point, this wall, where what she thought was going okay wasn't, rocks her world. And then it's not this okay, well, let me just go in and tweak or fix it and go back to the game. It's more about let me fix this thing, unwire and rewire the way that I've been living my work life, and then test it, and then continue to test it and keep track of it for the next several years to see if it's really making impact. And that takes a lot of, I think, emotional agility and just stamina, mental, stamina to keep up with that and be dedicated to wanting to see a positive end result. I don't know if I can do it.
I think that it takes not only the mental agility, but also the emotional fortitude to be willing to undergo that process. Because there's a lot, she was so excited. She got such great positive reviews. And then she said, actually, I'm failing. And that freaking sucks. That's stupid sucks. Is that everyone's telling you you're doing great, but you think deep down that maybe you're not so great. And being able to face that and then do something about that, that's emotional fortitude.
For sure. Whenever, okay, maybe you don't do this, but women do this. I do this all the time, is I'm trying on different outfits for, dinner or going out or whatever. Not really anymore. But I ask my friend, or I ask, send a picture of myself to my mom or something. I'm like, what do you think about this outfit? And they give me, oh, it looks great, or that's really cute or whatever. But deep down, I'm like, I don't really feel comfortable in it, or it's not what I'm in the mood for, or whatever. It doesn't matter what people say or how much they like it. I know that it's not right for me tonight. So I still have to go back and change. And in a sense, that's harder than just taking that person's, validation and moving on with it. And what Nina was doing is that same thing. Is she got these smile sheets with glowing reviews, and that makes you feel all warm and toasty, like you're doing something right. But deep down, she knew, because she had that result in her face of her students not knowing what was going on, that it still wasn't quite right. It wasn't sitting well with her. And so she had to go back to the drawing board to do what was going to feel right for her and for her students, that's pretty incredible. It takes a lot more effort and energy to do that than just to keep moving forward with all the pats on the back, you know?
Oh, yeah. So what would you say is like a useful thing that we could pick up from Nina, or that other people listening could say, I can do this now. I can put this into action. Like, what's a practical?
A takeaway for me in the business world is about feedback and how there is a better way that we can both give and ask for feedback in order to use that information to like really move the needle in a way that's effective for our lives personally and for our work professionally, whether that's getting feedback on or asking, hey Dan, how did you think I presented myself professionally in that Zoom meeting that we had? And I want you to give me the real, honest, specific, timely information that's going to help me be better. Right? Well, it's the truth, in a less structured way. But I think the more that we can incorporate feedback and asking for it and giving it in a smart way, but the more likely we are to achieve our dreams and our goals and feel good about what we're trying to do.
So one of the takeaways for me, I think one of the major turning points in Nina's story was going to the Center for Teaching Excellence and having this whole new world open up to her. And I think all of us have organizations or groups of people or friends that we can tap if we're open to change and willing to be vulnerable. And I think finding those types of organizations or those spaces, those communities, is really what's going to change your bigger picture understanding of the world as you see it. It's putting yourself out there, but to the right place. It's not just like putting yourself out there and seeing what the world throws at you. It's going to the place that you are going to get the best feedback that you need to be good at what you do. And I think it's going to be hard for some industries to find exactly what that looks like, but I guarantee there's somebody out there who will sit down and help you have some feedback on what you're doing or what's important to you.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think that you could probably do that, and maybe you this is what you meant, but you can do that as an individual, but you can also do it as an organization. Yeah. And as an individual, it could be looking within your company or even outside your company with a coach, with an association, with a friend or a colleague that might be in some type of similar industry but has a different perspective. For me, this would be you. Because you're in a whole different, a city, and we do the same things-ish, but not, we do it for different types of people and companies. So having that person might be key to getting out of your own way and getting those additional perspectives.
Thanks to No BS Brass Band for the Bang & Show music. Check them out at nobsbrass.com. And subscribe on your favorite podcast player, or follow us on Facebook to get the newest failures delivered right to your ears. And may your failures be spectacular.